The blood dripped in slow crimson dots onto the parched Kansas soil as Garrett Quinn dragged himself across the prairie, each labored movement sending waves of agony through his bullet-riddled body. 3 days earlier, he'd been left for dead by the notorious Blackburn Gang after a stagecoach robbery gone wrong. He'd been the driver, and the only one who'd seen their faces. Now, miles from anywhere, with the merciless June sun of 1878 beating down on him, he knew he wouldn't last another day. The world spun in painful circles as Garrett collapsed at the base of a cottonwood tree. His vision dimmed, consciousness slipping away when he thought he glimpsed a figure approaching through the wavering heat. A hallucination, surely a cruel trick of his dying mind. But then cool hands touched his fevered skin, and a woman's voice cut through his delirium. "Hold still now," she said firmly. "You're more holes than man at this point." Garrett forced his eyes open, expecting to see an angel of death. Instead, he found himself staring into the steady gaze of a woman with copper-colored hair, her sleeves rolled up as she calmly cleaned the worst of his wounds. She didn't flinch at the sight of his mangled flesh, didn't recoil from the blood that soaked his tattered clothes. "Am I dead?" He rasped, his throat parched and raw. "Not yet," she replied, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. Though from the look of things it wasn't for lack of trying, before he could respond, darkness claimed him once more. Violet Davenport had been gathering medicinal herbs along the creek when she'd spotted the fallen man. At first, she'd considered riding for help. Her small homestead was only a mile away, but one look at his ashen face told her he wouldn't survive the wait. With practiced efficiency, she had cut away his blood-soaked shirt, cleaned his wounds, and extracted a bullet lodged beneath his collarbone, all while keeping an eye on the horizon for whoever had tried to kill him. Now, as the stranger lay unconscious in her wagon, Violet clicked her tongue to urge her horse forward. 6 years as a frontier nurse during the war had taught her how to handle broken men, but this one with 3 bullet wounds and enough cuts and bruises to suggest he'd been dragged behind a horse was testing even her considerable skills. "Hang on, cowboy," she murmured, though she doubted he could hear her. "My cabin's just up ahead." The small homestead appeared as they crested a gentle rise, a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn, and a corral where her 2 horses grazed peacefully. It wasn't much, but it was hers, carved out of the Kansas prairie through sheer determination after her husband's death 3 years earlier. Getting the unconscious man into the cabin proved challenging, but Violet was stronger than her slender frame suggested. She managed to drag him onto her bed where she could properly tend to his wounds. As she worked, she studied his face, strong features, weathered by sun and hardship, but handsome in a rugged way. His hands bore the calluses of hard work, and even unconscious, there was something about the set of his jaw that spoke of stubborn resilience. "You're a fighter," she said approvingly as she stitched a deep gash along his ribs. "Good, you'll need to be." For 3 days and nights, Garrett hovered between life and death, burning with fever as infection threatened to claim him. Violet barely slept, applying poultices of yarrow and willow bark, bathing his fevered skin with cool water, and forcing broth between his cracked lips whenever he showed signs of consciousness. On the morning of the 4th day, when Violet had begun to fear her efforts were in vain, Garrett's fever broke. She was dozing in a chair beside the bed when his voice, rough but clear, startled her awake. "Where am I?" Violet straightened, brushing a strand of copper hair from her face. "My cabin, about 20 miles outside of Dodge City." His eyes, a startling shade of blue, took in his surroundings with cautious assessment before returning to her face. "How long have I been here?" 4 days. You've been more dead than alive for most of it." She poured water from a pitcher into a cup and helped him drink. "I'm Violet Davenport." "Garrett Quinn," he replied, wincing as he shifted position. "I owe you my life, Miss Davenport." "Mrs.," she corrected gently, "though my husband's been gone 3 years now." Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or shared grief. "I'm sorry to hear that." Violet nodded acknowledgement, then returned to practicalities. "You've got 3 bullet wounds, Mr. Quinn. One grazed your side, another went clean through your shoulder, and I had to dig the third out from under your collarbone. Whoever shot you meant business." A shadow crossed his face. "The Blackburn Gang. I was driving a stagecoach they robbed outside of Wichita. They didn't take kindly to witnesses." "Well, they didn't finish the job," Violet said matter-of-factly, rising to check his bandages, "though it was a near thing." Garrett caught her wrist gently as she reached for the bandage on his shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his eyes holding hers. Not many would stop for a stranger bleeding out on the prairie. "I was a nurse during the war," she replied. "Helping the wounded is second nature now." She carefully freed her wrist from his grasp. "You should rest. Your body's been through an ordeal." As the days passed, Garrett slowly regained his strength. At first, he could barely sit up without assistance, but Violet was a strict taskmaster, insisting he eat to rebuild his strength and gradually increase his movements despite the pain. "The longer you lie there, the harder it'll be to get back on your feet," she told him firmly when he groaned in protest at her insistence he try standing. "I didn't save your life just so you could waste away in my bed. Your bedside manner could use some softening, Mrs. Davenport," Garrett remarked dryly, but he obeyed, gritting his teeth as she helped him to his feet. "Soft words don't heal bullet wounds," she retorted. "And call me Violet. Mrs. Davenport makes me feel like my mother-in-law." A week after he'd arrived at her cabin, Garrett was able to make his way to the porch, where he sat watching Violet tend her vegetable garden. There was a grace to her movements, an efficiency that spoke of a woman accustomed to handling life's challenges alone. In the late afternoon light, her copper hair gleamed like burnished metal, and Garrett found himself wondering about the woman who had saved him with such calm competence. "Were you alone out here before I arrived?" he asked when she approached the porch with a basket of vegetables. Violet nodded. "Since Thomas died, we came out here from Pennsylvania after the war. He wanted to start fresh, away from the memories." A shadow crossed her face. "Influenza took him 3 winters ago, and you stayed. This is my home now." She gestured to the small homestead. "I grow most of what I need, and I trade medicinal herbs and nursing services in Dodge City for the rest. It can't be easy, a woman alone out here." Violet's chin lifted slightly. "I manage. The nearest neighbors are 5 miles that way," she pointed west, "and they check in when they can. Most folks around here know I was a battlefield nurse. They respect that." Garrett nodded, understanding what she didn't say, that her wartime experience had marked her, just as it had marked so many others. "Still, the frontier's no place for solitude." "Says the man I found half dead and alone on the prairie," she responded with a raised eyebrow. He conceded with a slight smile. "Fair point." As Garrett continued to recover, he began helping with small tasks around the homestead, mending a broken fence, repairing a leaky roof, chopping wood for the cookstove. Violet protested at first, insisting he would reopen his wounds, but he was as stubborn as she was. "I won't be a burden," he told her firmly. "Not when you've already done so much." Slowly, a routine developed between them. Mornings saw Violet checking his wounds and changing bandages before they shared a simple breakfast. Afternoons were spent with Garrett doing what work he could manage while Violet tended to her garden, preserved food, or prepared herbal remedies. Evenings found them on the porch, watching the sunset paint the vast Kansas sky in spectacular hues while they talked. Garrett told her about growing up in Missouri, learning to drive stage coaches from his father, and the years spent traversing the frontier routes. Violet shared stories of her Pennsylvania childhood, her decision to become a nurse when the war broke out, and the horrors and occasional triumphs she'd witnessed in field hospitals. "I was engaged to Thomas before the war," she explained one evening. "He joined up right away, infantry. I couldn't bear sitting at home waiting, so I volunteered as a nurse. We were married on one of his furloughs just before Gettysburg. Did he approve? Of you nursing, I mean." Garrett was leaning against a porch post, whittling a piece of wood as they talked. Violet smiled at the memory. "Not at first. He wanted me safe at home. But after he was wounded at Antietam and saw what the nurses did for the men." She paused. "He understood then. Said he was proud of me." Garrett nodded, studying her profile in the fading light. "He should have been. Takes courage to face that kind of suffering day after day." "It changes you," she admitted quietly. "Makes you see things differently. After witnessing so much death, you either learn to value life fiercely or you become numb to it altogether." "And which were you?" Her green eyes met his, clear and direct. "I chose to value life. Every day." 2 weeks after Garrett's arrival, as they sat eating supper, the distant sound of approaching horses broke the evening quiet. Violet tensed, setting down her fork and moving to the window. "Are you expecting visitors?" Garrett asked, already reaching for the rifle that hung by the door. "No." Her voice was taut with concern. "It's unusual to have riders this late." Garrett checked that the rifle was loaded. "Stay inside," he said, moving toward the door despite the pain that still accompanied sudden movements. "You're in no condition to face trouble," Violet protested, but she reached for her husband's old revolver in a drawer nonetheless. They watched through the window as 3 riders approached the cabin, their features obscured in the gathering dusk. When they drew closer, Garrett's body went rigid. "Blackburn men," he muttered grimly. "The one on the left is Sam Reeves. He's the one who shot me." Violet's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "They must have tracked you somehow. Or they're just passing through and stopped for water." Even as he said it, Garrett knew it was wishful thinking. "Either way, I won't bring danger to your door. You saved my life. I won't repay that by getting you killed." Before she could stop him, he was moving toward the back door. "If they ask, you haven't seen me. I'll draw them away from here." "That's suicide," Violet hissed, grabbing his arm. "You can barely stay on a horse and there are 3 of them." "Better me than both of us," he replied, his jaw set in stubborn determination. "No," her grip on his arm tightened. "There's another way." Quickly, she outlined a plan. Garrett argued, but the approaching riders left no time for debate. When Sam Reeves knocked on the cabin door, it was opened by a composed woman in a simple dress, a wary but not unfriendly expression on her face. "Evening, madam," Reeves said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sorry to trouble you so late. We're looking for a man, stagecoach driver. Might have passed this way about 2 weeks back." "I don't get many visitors out here," Violet replied, maintaining a careful distance from the door. "What's he done?" "Witnessed something he shouldn't have," another rider interjected. "Tall fellow, dark hair, would have been injured." Violet seemed to consider this. "I did find an injured man about 2 weeks ago, now that you mention it. He was in bad shape, fever, bullet wounds." The men exchanged glances. "Where is he now?" Reeves demanded. "Dead," Violet stated flatly. "The infection took him. I buried him out back by the old oak tree." She gestured toward the rear of the property. "I said prayers over him, though he never did regain consciousness to tell me his name." Reeves's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You buried a stranger on your land, just like that?" "I was a war nurse, mister." Reeves, Sam Reeves, Mr. Reeves. I've buried more men than I care to count. One more makes little difference. She crossed her arms. I can show you the grave if you don't believe me. The third man, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. What you do with his things? Burn the clothes, they were soaked in blood and infection. There wasn't much else except this. Violet reached into her pocket and produced a tarnished pocket watch Garrett's, which she'd taken from his vest the day she found him. I kept it, thinking someone might come looking for him someday. Reeves took the watch, examining it before nodding to his companions. That's Quinn's all right. Looks like our problem solved itself. If that's all, gentlemen, I have chores to finish before dark, Violet said coolly. Reeves handed her a silver dollar. For your trouble, madam, and the burial. Violet accepted it with a nod, watching as the men returned to their horses. Only when they had ridden well out of sight did she close and bolt the door, letting out a shaky breath. You're quite the actress, Garrett said quietly, emerging from the root cellar where he'd hidden during the confrontation. Not really, she replied, her hands trembling slightly as the tension ebbed. I've just had practice keeping my composure in difficult situations. She handed him back his pocket watch, which she'd managed to slip from Reeves's hand during a moment of distraction. They believed you're dead. That should buy us some time. Us? Garrett questioned, his eyebrow raised. Violet met his gaze steadily. They've seen my face now. If they ever discover I lied, they might come back. We're in this together whether we like it or not. The realization that he had inadvertently drawn Violet into his dangerous situation weighed heavily on Garrett. That night, after she had gone to bed in the small alcove she'd been using while he recovered in her bedroom, he sat at her table writing a note. He would leave before dawn, he decided. Head north, perhaps to Nebraska or the Dakota Territory, somewhere the Blackburn Gang wouldn't follow. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't hear Violet approach until she spoke. Running away won't solve anything, she said quietly. Garrett looked up, startled. I'm putting you in danger by staying. You're putting us both in danger by leaving, she countered, sitting across from him. You're still healing, and now that they believe you're dead, this is the safest place for you, until they discover the truth. Why would they? As far as they know, you're buried under the oak tree. She gestured toward his half-written note. Besides, where would you go? Back to driving stagecoaches where they might recognize you, Garrett sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. I can't stay here indefinitely, Violet. You have your life, and I've already imposed enough. I'm not asking for indefinitely, she replied pragmatically. Just until you're fully healed and we can figure out a better plan than you riding off half-recovered in the middle of the night. Her expression softened slightly. I didn't save your life just to have you throw it away on some misguided notion of protecting me. There was logic in her words, Garrett had to admit. He was still weak, his wounds not fully healed. And if the Blackburn Gang truly believed him dead, perhaps this was the safest place for now. 2 more weeks, he conceded finally. Time enough to regain my strength, then I'll move on. Violet nodded, though something in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied with this solution. 2 weeks then, she agreed. Now get some sleep. Morning comes early on a homestead. As spring turned to summer, the Kansas prairie bloomed with wildflowers, and Garrett's strength returned more fully with each passing day. The 2 weeks he had agreed to stay stretched into 3, then 4, as there always seemed to be one more project that needed his attention: a leaky roof before the summer thunderstorms, replanting a section of the garden damaged by rabbits, breaking the new colt Violet had acquired in trade for her nursing services. For her part, Violet found herself growing accustomed to his presence. After 3 years of solitude, the simple pleasure of shared meals and conversation was unexpectedly welcome. Garrett proved to be not just strong but skilled, with a patient hand for animals and a knack for fixing things she hadn't even realized needed repair. One afternoon in late July, they rode together to check the farthest corner of her property, where a small creek provided water for her livestock. The summer heat was intense, the air heavy with the promise of an evening thunderstorm. Thomas and I had planned to build a proper irrigation system from the creek to the garden, Violet remarked as they dismounted to rest the horses. Never got around to it before he fell ill. Garrett studied the lay of the land with an appraising eye. It's doable. Wouldn't take more than a week or two with the right materials. Maybe someday, she said with a small shrug. There's always something more pressing. Like what? He challenged gently. Your roof doesn't leak anymore, your fence is mended, and your garden's producing more than you can eat. Violet picked a stem of prairie grass, twisting it between her fingers. There's always winter to prepare for. Preserving, gathering enough firewood, mending clothes. All things that would go faster with help, he pointed out. She glanced at him, a question in her green eyes. Are you offering to stay through winter, Garrett Quinn? It was the first time either of them had directly acknowledged that his temporary stay had evolved into something less defined. The 2 weeks he had promised had long since passed, yet neither had mentioned his departure again. I'm saying I could, he replied carefully, if you wanted the help. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that had been building imperceptibly over the weeks they had spent together. And after winter, she asked, her voice deliberately neutral. Before he could answer, a distant rumble of thunder interrupted the moment. Looking up, they saw dark clouds gathering on the horizon, moving quickly in their direction. Storm's coming faster than I thought, Violet said, all practical concern once more as she mounted her horse. We should head back. They rode hard, but the storm moved faster, catching them when they were still a mile from the cabin. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the prairie trail slick and treacherous. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed immediately by deafening thunder that spooked Violet's mare. The horse reared, nearly unseating her. Garrett reached over to grab her reins, but the next flash of lightning struck a tree just yards away, sending both horses into a panic. Violet's mare bolted, with Garrett's gelding following closely behind. For several terrifying minutes, they galloped at breakneck speed through the storm, Violet clinging to her saddle as her mare charged blindly forward. When they finally managed to regain control, they found themselves disoriented in the downpour. This way. Garrett shouted over the storm, gesturing toward a rocky outcropping that offered minimal shelter. They dismounted and huddled beneath the overhang, soaked to the skin and breathing hard from the wild ride. Are you all right? Garrett asked, his eyes searching her face with concern. Violet nodded, pushing wet strands of hair from her face. Just rattled. That lightning was too close for comfort. They stood close together in the cramped shelter, the storm raging around them. Water dripped from Garrett's dark hair onto his face, and without thinking, Violet reached up to brush it away. Her hand lingered on his cheek, and suddenly, she was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers despite the chill of the rain. Garrett's blue eyes darkened as he covered her hand with his own, holding it against his face for a heartbeat, before slowly leaning down. The first brush of his lips against hers was tentative, questioning. When she didn't pull away, he kissed her more firmly, his hand moving to cup the back of her neck. Violet had not been kissed since Thomas died, had not even considered the possibility of such intimacy again. Yet here, in the midst of a prairie thunderstorm, she found herself responding with a passion that surprised her, her arms wrapping around Garrett's neck as she pressed closer to him. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, and it had nothing to do with their earlier flight from the storm. They stared at each other in the dim light, the air between them charged with more than just the lightning that continued to flash across the sky. "I didn't plan that," Garrett said quietly. "Neither did I," Violet admitted. She took a small step back, creating a sliver of space between them. "We should wait out the worst of the storm, then head back." Garrett nodded, respecting her need for distance even as his eyes told her this conversation was far from over. They returned to the cabin as dusk fell, the storm gradually moving eastward. An awkward silence had settled between them, neither quite ready to address what had happened in the rocky shelter. After changing into dry clothes, Violet busied herself preparing supper while Garrett tended to the horses. They ate mostly in silence, occasional attempts at normal conversation falling flat under the weight of unspoken words. Finally, as they cleared away the dishes, Garrett broke the tension. "I should apologize for what happened earlier," he said, setting down the plate he was drying. Violet paused in her washing. "Should you? I don't know," he admitted. "I'm not sorry it happened, but I am sorry if it complicates things for you." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "It does complicate things. I wasn't looking for this, whatever this is." "Neither was I," Garrett said honestly. "When you found me on the prairie, I was half dead and fully convinced my life was over. I certainly wasn't thinking about starting something new. And yet here we are," Violet said softly. Garrett took a step closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head to maintain eye contact. "Here we are," he agreed. "The question is, where do we go from here?" Violet took a deep breath. "I don't know, Garrett. It's been 3 years since Thomas died. I've grown accustomed to being alone, to making my own decisions." "I'm not asking you to change that," he said. "I respect your independence. It's one of the things I admire most about you." "Then what are you asking?" His eyes held hers steadily. "Just a chance. Time to see if what I'm feeling, what I think we're both feeling, is worth exploring." Violet considered his words, acutely aware of how her life had shifted since the day she found him wounded on the prairie. The loneliness she had grown to accept as her lot had receded during his stay, replaced by a warmth she had not expected to feel again. "I can't make any promises," she said finally. "This is unexpected." "For me too," he assured her. "We can take it slowly, day by day." Slowly, she nodded. "Day by day," she agreed, and was rewarded with a smile that made her heart skip in a way it hadn't done in years. That night, as she lay in her alcove listening to Garrett's steady breathing from the main room where he now slept, Violet found herself wondering if she was making a mistake. She had built a life for herself after Thomas died, had found purpose and meaning in her independence. Opening her heart again meant risking pain she wasn't sure she could bear a second time. Yet there was something about Garrett Quinn that challenged her careful solitude, something in his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness that made her wonder if perhaps the greater risk was in refusing to take any chance at all. As summer progressed into early autumn, their relationship evolved cautiously. Small touches his hand on the small of her back as they walked, her fingers brushing his when passing a tool became more frequent. Conversations deepened, sharing not just daily events but hopes, fears, and memories long kept private. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Garrett broached a subject they had both been avoiding. "I need to go to Dodge City," he said. "There are things we need that we can't produce here, and you're running low on supplies." Violet tensed beside him. "It's risky. The Blackburn Gang has connections there." "I know," he acknowledged, "but I can't hide forever. Besides, it's been months." They believe I'm dead. And if someone recognizes you, I'll be careful, he promised. I'll grow out my beard more, wear different clothes. I won't stay longer than necessary. Violet was silent for a long moment, staring out at the darkening prairie. I'll go with you, she finally said. I need to replenish my medicinal supplies anyway, and 2 sets of eyes watching for trouble are better than 1. Garrett started to protest, then reconsidered. Her medical knowledge was respected in Dodge City. Her presence might provide additional cover. And truthfully, the thought of leaving her alone on the homestead for several days troubled him more than he cared to admit. All right, he agreed. We'll go together. First frost can't be more than a few weeks away, and we need to be prepared. They made the journey to Dodge City the following week, taking the wagon and camping one night on the trail. Garrett had indeed grown his beard, and with a different hat and coat, he looked sufficiently altered that casual acquaintances might not recognize him immediately. Dodge City in 1878 was still very much a frontier town, despite the civilizing influence of the railroad. Cowboys fresh off the trail mingled with merchants, farmers, and the occasional drifter looking for work or trouble. The main street was lined with saloons, trading posts, and hotels catering to every purse and purpose. Violet's first stop was the apothecary, where she traded some of her specially prepared herbal remedies for medicines she couldn't produce herself. Garrett, meanwhile, purchased provisions they would need for winter: flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, and tools to replace those worn beyond repair. Their business nearly complete, they stopped for a meal at a small cafe on the edge of town. They were finishing their food when Garrett suddenly stiffened, his gaze fixed on the window. "Sam Reeves just walked into the saloon across the street," he said quietly. "With 2 others I don't recognize." Violet's hand tightened on her fork. "Did he see us?" "I don't think so." Garrett's mind raced through their options. "We should leave now, while they're occupied." They paid quickly and headed for their wagon, moving with deliberate calm to avoid drawing attention. They were loading their purchases when a voice called out behind them. "Mrs. Davenport." What a pleasant surprise! Violet turned to see Emily Peterson, the wife of a local rancher who occasionally employed her nursing skills for his workers. "Mrs. Peterson, how lovely to see you," she replied, forcing a smile while Garrett kept his back turned, securing their supplies. "I haven't seen you in town for months," the woman continued. "How have you been managing out there all alone?" "Very well, thank you," Violet said, acutely aware of the saloon doors across the street. "I've actually had some help recently. My cousin has been staying with me." She gestured toward Garrett, who had no choice but to turn and tip his hat politely. "George Davenport, madam," he said, adopting an accent slightly different from his usual speech. "Pleasure to meet you." Mrs. Peterson beamed. "How wonderful! Violet has been alone far too long." "Are you planning to stay through winter, Mr. Davenport?" "That's the plan," Garrett replied. "If you'll excuse us, though, we should be heading back before dark." As they drove the wagon out of town, Violet let out a long breath. That was too close. If Emily Peterson hadn't appeared when she did. "Quick thinking with the cousin's story," Garrett said appreciatively. "Though I'm not sure about George Davenport." Despite the tension, Violet smiled. "I had to come up with something quickly. Besides, you played the role convincingly enough." They made camp that night in a small grove of trees, far enough from the main trail to avoid casual discovery. As they sat beside their small fire, the reality of their situation weighed heavily on both of them. "This can't go on indefinitely," Garrett said finally. "Living in fear of being recognized, inventing stories to explain my presence." "I know," Violet admitted. "But what's the alternative? The Blackburn Gang won't simply forget, especially if they learn you survived." Garrett was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "There's a marshal in Dodge City, Wyatt Earp. He's been working to bring law to the frontier if I testified against the Blackburns." "That's suicide," Violet interrupted sharply. "They'd kill you before you ever reached the witness stand." "Not if we had a plan," Garrett insisted. "Earp has deputies, and he's not afraid of the outlaws who have been controlling these territories. Even if he arrested them, their friends would come looking for revenge," Violet argued. "You'd never be safe." The firelight cast shadows across Garrett's face as he considered her words. "Then maybe it's time I moved on," he said quietly. "Further west, perhaps, Oregon or California." Violet felt something cold settle in her chest at his words. "I see," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "When would you leave?" Garrett looked up, meeting her gaze across the fire. "I said but I was thinking he clarified. If that's something you might consider." The suggestion hung in the air between them, momentous in its implications. Violet had built her life on this land, had buried her husband here and carved out a hard-won independence. "My home is here," she said softly. "I know," Garrett acknowledged. "And I wouldn't ask you to leave it lightly. But Violet, as long as I stay, you're in danger too. They've seen your face, they know where you live. So your solution is for both of us to abandon everything and run." There was a hint of anger in her voice now. "Not run," he corrected. "Start fresh, together." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand. "I love you, Violet. I think I have since you found me half dead and didn't flinch at the mess I was in. I want a future with you, but I want it to be safe." It was the first time either of them had spoken of love, though the feeling had been growing between them for months. Violet looked down at their joined hands, his larger one enclosing hers protectively. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This isn't a decision to make in haste." Garrett nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We have time. Winter's coming, and we won't be traveling anywhere until spring regardless." They returned to the homestead the next day, the question of their future hovering unresolved between them. Life settled back into its rhythm as they prepared for winter smoking meat, storing root vegetables in the cellar, gathering and chopping wood to keep the cabin warm through the coming cold months. Through it all, Violet found herself contemplating Garrett's suggestion more seriously than she had initially expected. The idea of leaving the home she had built with Thomas had once been unthinkable. Yet she found herself wondering what a fresh start might be like, especially with Garrett by her side. The first snow fell in mid-November, transforming the prairie into a vast white expanse that sparkled in the winter sun. Confined more to the cabin by the weather, Garrett and Violet found new patterns to their days, he whittling by the fire while she sewed, reading aloud to each other from the few books she owned, teaching each other card games they had learned in different parts of the country. Their physical relationship had progressed cautiously over the months, neither rushing the other. Kisses had grown more passionate, embraces lingering longer, but they had maintained separate sleeping arrangements by mutual, unspoken agreement. Both carried the values of their upbringing, and though no minister was available to formalize a union on the isolated prairie, they respected the traditions of their time. One evening in early December, as a blizzard howled outside the snug cabin, Garrett finished carving a small wooden box he had been working on for weeks. Violet watched curiously as he polished it with beeswax, bringing out the rich grain of the wood. "It's beautiful," she said admiringly. "What's it for?" Instead of answering directly, Garrett reached into his pocket and withdrew something small that he placed inside the box before closing the lid. Then he moved from his chair to kneel before her, the box held in his outstretched hand. "I've been thinking about what you said, about needing time," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "And you're right, leaving the home you've built isn't a decision to make lightly. But Violet, home for me isn't a place anymore. It's wherever you are." He opened the box to reveal a simple ring fashioned from a silver coin, not fancy, but clearly crafted with care and thought. "I can't offer you wealth or even complete safety," he continued. "But I can promise to love you, protect you, and build a life with you, whether that's here on this homestead or somewhere new. Violet Davenport, will you marry me?" Violet stared at the ring, then at the man kneeling before her, the man who had entered her life as a wounded stranger and become essential to her happiness in ways she had never anticipated. In that moment, the decision she had been weighing for weeks crystallized with sudden clarity. "Yes," she said, her voice warm with certainty. "Yes, I'll marry you, Garrett Quinn." His face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than words of the depth of his feelings. Later, as they sat close together before the fire, making plans for their future, Violet shared the conclusion she had reached during her weeks of consideration. "I think we should go west," she said. "Not because I'm afraid or because I don't love this land, but because I want to build something new with you, something that's ours together." Garrett studied her face, searching for any sign of reluctance. "Are you certain? This is your home." "It was the home I built with Thomas," she corrected gently, "and it will always be part of me. But you were right, home isn't just a place, it's the people we love." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "Besides, I hear Oregon has good land for farming, and they're always in need of medical skills on the frontier." "We'll leave in spring," Garrett decided. "Take what we can in the wagon and sell the rest. I have some savings from my stagecoach days, and what you get for the homestead will give us a good start." The remainder of winter passed in a blur of preparations and planning. They would marry officially in Dodge City before departing a risk, but one they felt was worth taking to begin their new life properly. Violet sorted through her possessions, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. The most precious mementos of Thomas, his wedding ring, letters, and a daguerreotype taken before the war, she carefully packed away. He would always be a part of her past, but Garrett was her future. For his part, Garrett worked through the winter months to ensure the homestead was in the best possible condition for sale. He repaired what needed fixing, built new shelving in the root cellar, and even constructed a proper chicken coop to replace the makeshift one Violet had been using. The better the property looked, the more it would bring when they sold it. They married on a clear day in early April 1879, in the small church in Dodge City. Violet wore her best dress, freshly altered for the occasion, with wildflowers in her copper hair. Garrett had purchased a new shirt and string tie, his normally unruly dark hair slicked down for the ceremony. The service was brief but meaningful, attended by the few neighbors who had become friends to Violet over the years. If anyone recognized Garrett as someone other than the cousin who had been helping Violet through winter, they gave no sign of it. As they exchanged vows, Violet found herself remembering her first wedding day, so many years and hardships ago. She had loved Thomas with the innocent passion of youth, and his loss had nearly broken her. Yet here she stood again, older and wiser, offering her heart to a man she had come to love with a deeper, more seasoned understanding of what such commitment meant. They spent their wedding night at the homestead, truly husband and wife at last. In the privacy of the bedroom that had once been hers alone, they discovered each other fully for the first time, their passion tempered by tenderness, their union both physical and spiritual in its completeness. "I never thought I would feel this way again," Violet confessed as they lay entwined in the darkness. After Thomas died, I believed that part of my life was over. Garrett kissed her temple gently. I never thought I would feel this way at all, he admitted. My life was the open road, moving from one job to the next. I never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. And now, he tightened his arms around her. Now I know what I was missing, what I want for the rest of my days. They left the homestead a week later, having sold it to a young couple newly arrived from Pennsylvania, a poetic symmetry that wasn't lost on Violet. Their wagon was loaded with the essentials for their journey: tools, seeds, medicines, clothing, and the few personal items they couldn't bear to leave behind. The horses were strong, the spring weather favorable for travel. As they crested the small rise that would take the homestead out of sight, Violet asked Garrett to stop the wagon. She climbed down and walked a few paces back, gazing at the place that had been her home for 5 years through joy and grief, solitude and newfound love. "Goodbye," she whispered, not just to the land and the cabin, but to the ghosts of the past that would remain here while she moved forward. She placed a hand on her stomach, where the first stirrings of new life had made themselves known to her just days before. She hadn't told Garrett yet, wanting to be certain before sharing news that would add both joy and complication to their journey west. When she returned to the wagon, Garrett helped her up to the seat beside him. "Ready?" he asked, his blue eyes warm with understanding of what this moment meant to her. Violet nodded, her copper hair gleaming in the morning sun. "Ready," she confirmed, and they set off toward the western horizon, leaving behind the prairie that had witnessed both the darkest and brightest moments of their lives. Their journey west was not without challenges. The Oregon Trail, though well established by 1879, still presented hazards both natural and human. They faced spring storms that turned the trail to mud, river crossings that tested their nerve, and the constant vigilance required when traveling through territories where law was often a distant concept. They joined a wagon train in Kansas City, finding safety in numbers and companionship in shared hardship. Violet's medical skills quickly made her valued among the travelers, while Garrett's experience with horses and his ability to hunt kept their supplies replenished. It was on the banks of the North Platte River in Nebraska that Violet finally shared her secret with Garrett. They had stopped for the evening, the wagon train forming its customary circle for the night. As they sat beside their small fire, somewhat apart from the others, she took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We'll be 3 when we reach Oregon," she said softly. Garrett's expression transformed from confusion to wonder as her meaning registered. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're certain?" Violet nodded, her eyes shining in the firelight. "About 3 months along now. I wanted to be sure before I told you." A slow, radiant smile spread across his face as he gathered her into his arms. "A child," he murmured against her hair. "Our child." The news added both urgency and caution to their journey. They needed to reach Oregon before winter and certainly before Violet's condition made travel impossible, yet they had to proceed carefully to protect both mother and unborn child. The wagon train's leader, a veteran of multiple crossings named Jenkins, adjusted their pace when informed of Violet's condition. "Seen plenty of babies born on the trail," he told them gruffly. "Rather not add to that tally if we can help it." As they traveled through the territories, Garrett remained vigilant for any sign of the Blackburn Gang or their associates. Their route took them far from the gang's usual haunts, and as the miles stretched between them and Kansas, the immediate fear of discovery gradually subsided. They crossed the Continental Divide in late July, Violet's pregnancy now visible beneath her dresses. The most difficult mountain passages lay ahead, but the knowledge that each mile brought them closer to their destination bolstered their determination. It was in a small settlement in eastern Idaho, where they had stopped to rest and replenish supplies, that the past Garrett had hoped to outrun finally caught up with them. He was purchasing ammunition at the general store when he overheard a conversation between two men that made his blood run cold. Blackburn's offering $500 for information on a stagecoach driver named Quinn, one was saying. Seems he survived some shooting and disappeared. Word is he might be headed west. What's Blackburn want with him? The other asked. Witnessed a robbery gone bad. Blackburn's worried he'll testify if he ever resurfaces. Garrett completed his purchase without revealing his reaction and returned to the wagon where Violet waited. The look on his face must have betrayed his concern, for she immediately sensed something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked quietly, mindful of the other travelers nearby. "Blackburn's still looking for me," Garrett replied in a low voice. "He's put out word all the way to Idaho." Violet's hand went instinctively to her rounded belly. "What do we do?" Garrett considered their options. They could continue with the wagon train as planned, hoping to reach Oregon without further incident. Or they could separate from the group, taking a less traveled route where they might avoid notice. Both choices carried risks. "We stay with the train for now," he decided finally. "There's safety in numbers, and leaving suddenly might draw attention, but we need to be more careful than ever." That night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Garrett slipped out of their wagon to stand watch, his rifle across his knees as he scanned the darkness surrounding their camp. The burden of knowing his past still threatened their future weighed heavily on him. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear Violet approach until she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You should be resting," he said, covering her hand with his own. "So should you," she countered, easing herself down beside him. "The baby keeps me awake anyway." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the stars wheel overhead in the vast Idaho sky. Finally, Violet spoke the words that had been taking shape in her mind since hearing Garrett's news. "We can't run forever," she said quietly. "Even if we reach Oregon safely, how long before Blackburn's men track us there? How long before we're looking over our shoulders again?" Garrett sighed, knowing she was right. "What are you suggesting?" "That we face this directly," Violet replied. "Not with guns or violence, but with the law." She turned to look at him directly. "You mentioned Marshal Earp before. There must be federal marshals in this territory too, if you gave testimony against the Blackburns." "I'd be putting a target on my back on all our backs," Garrett argued. "We already have targets on our backs," she pointed out. "At least this way we'd have the law on our side, and once the Blackburns are brought to justice, we could truly start fresh, without fear." Garrett was silent for a long moment, weighing her words against his instinct to keep running. "It's risky," he said finally. "But you may be right. Living in fear is no life at all, especially for our child." The decision made, they altered their plans. Instead of continuing directly to Oregon with the wagon train, they would stop at Fort Boys, where a federal marshal was stationed. It meant a delay in their journey, but the possibility of freedom from the shadow of the Blackburn Gang was worth the risk. They reached Fort Boys in early August, the mountains rising majestically in the distance. The fort was a bustling outpost, with soldiers, settlers, and indigenous people moving about their business under the hot summer sun. Garrett sought out Marshal Davis, a stern-faced man with a reputation for incorruptibility. In the privacy of the marshal's office, he told his story: the stagecoach robbery, the shooting that had left him for dead, and his subsequent months in hiding. "The Blackburns have been operating with impunity for too long," Davis said when Garrett had finished. but witnesses tend to disappear or change their stories when it comes time for trial. He studied Garrett with assessing eyes. "You'd be taking a considerable risk, Mr. Quinn. You and your family both." "I understand that," Garrett replied, "but we can't build a life looking over our shoulders. My wife is expecting our first child. I want that child to grow up without the shadow of the past hanging over us." Davis nodded slowly. "I can arrange for protection during the trial. After that, if the Blackburns are convicted, you should be relatively safe. They have associates, of course, but most are opportunists who won't risk themselves once the leadership is gone." "And if they're not convicted?" Violet asked from where she sat beside Garrett, her hands resting protectively over her belly. "Then we'll discuss other options," Davis said grimly. "But my cases tend to end in convictions, Mrs. Quinn. I'm thorough." The plan took shape over the following days. Davis would send word to authorities in Kansas and surrounding territories where the Blackburns were known to operate. Warrants would be issued, and with luck, the gang would be apprehended before they realized Garrett had resurfaced. In the meantime, Garrett and Violet would remain under protection at Fort Boys, their presence kept as discreet as possible. It wasn't ideal. Violet's pregnancy was advancing, and they had hoped to be settled before the birth, but it was their best chance at a truly free future. 2 weeks passed with no word. Violet, now in her 7th month, tried to make their temporary quarters at the fort as comfortable as possible. Garrett assisted the marshal with other cases, his knowledge of the territories proving valuable while they waited for news of the Blackburns. It was a clear September morning when Marshal Davis arrived at their quarters, his expression unreadable. "We've got them," he announced without preamble. "Most of them anyway. Sam Reeves and Jacob Blackburn were captured in Wichita. 2 others were shot resisting arrest." Relief washed over Garrett, followed immediately by caution. "Most of them?" he questioned. Davis nodded grimly. "William Blackburn, Jacob's brother, is still at large." "And he knows we have his brother." Violet's hand found Garrett's, squeezing tightly. "What does this mean for us?" "It means we need to move quickly," Davis replied. "The trial is set for 3 weeks from now in Topeka. We'll need to travel there immediately for Garrett to testify." "Topeka," Violet repeated, alarm evident in her voice. "That's weeks of travel, and I'm due in less than 2 months." Davis's expression softened slightly. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Quinn, but without your husband's testimony, the case against the Blackburns weakens significantly. They've been careful not to leave evidence." Garrett looked at Violet, torn between his duty to justice and his responsibility to his wife and unborn child. "There must be another way," he said. "A deposition, perhaps." Davis shook his head. "Defense will tear it apart. The jury needs to see you, hear directly from the man who survived the Blackburns' attempt to silence him." He paused. "I can arrange for a physician to accompany us, to monitor Mrs. Quinn's condition during the journey." Left with little choice, they prepared for the journey back east, a reversal of the course they had set months earlier when leaving Kansas. Their wagon was modified for Violet's comfort as much as possible, with extra padding on the seat and frequent stops planned along the route. Dr. Simmons, the physician who would accompany them, was a kindly man in his 50s who had served as an Army surgeon before settling at Fort Boys. "We'll take every precaution," he assured them, "and I've delivered more babies than I can count, should the need arise." They departed Fort Boys under escort, Marshal Davis and 2 deputies forming a protective detail. The journey would be arduous under the best circumstances, with Violet's advanced pregnancy and the threat of William Blackburn potentially seeking revenge. Every mile felt fraught with danger. Yet as they traveled, a strange sense of rightness settled over Garrett. For months he had been running, first from death and then from the men who had tried to kill him. Now, despite the risks, he was finally facing the threat directly. Whatever the outcome of the trial, he would no longer be a man in hiding. They were crossing the Nebraska territory, less than a week from Topeka, when Violet went into labor. It was premature. She was still 3 weeks from her due date, and Dr. Simmons immediately ordered a halt to their journey. "First babies often come early," he told Garrett, who paced anxiously outside the wagon where Violet lay. "But we need to be cautious." A makeshift camp was established, with the deputies maintaining vigilant watch while Dr. Simmons attended to Violet. Marshal Davis approached Garrett as the sun began to set, his expression grave. "We're exposed here," he said bluntly. "If William Blackburn has men in this area—" "We're not moving her," Garrett interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Not while she's in labor." Davis nodded, accepting the inevitable. "We'll strengthen our defenses, but if we're delayed more than a day or two, the trial may have to proceed without you." "Then it proceeds without me," Garrett replied firmly. "My wife and child come first." Throughout the night, Violet's labor progressed slowly. Garrett stayed by her side, wiping her brow and offering what comfort he could as Dr. Simmons monitored her condition. Outside, the deputies maintained their watch, alert for any sign of threat in the surrounding prairie. Dawn was breaking when Violet's pains intensified, her cries muffled against Garrett's shoulder as he held her through each contraction. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he whispered. "You can do this." As the sun rose fully over the Nebraska plains, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to Garrett's eyes. Dr. Simmons cleaned and swaddled the tiny infant before placing her in Violet's arms. "She's perfect," Violet whispered, exhaustion and joy mingling in her voice as she gazed at their child. "Small, but perfect." Garrett's throat tightened with emotion as he looked at his wife and daughter, the family he had never dared to dream of in his solitary days as a stagecoach driver. "What shall we call her?" he asked. Violet considered the tiny face, already showing signs of Garrett's features in the shape of her nose and brow. "Hope," she decided, "because that's what she represents for us. Hope for a new beginning." "Hope Quinn," Garrett agreed, gently touching his daughter's cheek. "It's perfect." The birth of Hope altered their plans significantly. Dr. Simmons insisted that Violet needed at least a week of rest before continuing the journey, and even then, travel would be risky for both mother and infant. Marshal Davis, torn between his duty to justice and his responsibility to the family under his protection, eventually made a difficult decision. "I'll continue to Topeka with one deputy," he told Garrett. "The other will remain with you as protection. When Mrs. Quinn and the baby are strong enough to travel, you can join us. If the trial proceeds before you arrive, we'll delay your testimony as long as possible." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but acknowledged the realities of their situation. Davis departed the next morning, leaving Deputy Miller to guard the small camp where Violet recovered, and baby Hope grew stronger day by day. A week passed, then another. Violet regained her strength gradually, and Hope thrived despite her early arrival. Yet Garrett knew they couldn't remain indefinitely in their makeshift camp. Winter would come early to the plains, and they needed to reach either Topeka or their original destination in Oregon before the first snows. They were discussing their options one evening when Deputy Miller returned from hunting with news that would once again alter their course. "Riders approaching from the east," he reported grimly. "6 of them, moving fast. Could be coincidence, but—" "But we can't take that chance," Garrett finished. "How long do we have? An hour, maybe less." Moving with urgent efficiency, they broke camp, loading the wagon with only the essentials. Violet, still weak from childbirth, held Hope close as Garrett and Miller worked to erase as many signs of their presence as possible. "We can't outrun them," Garrett said as he helped Violet into the wagon. "Not with the wagon. We need to find a defensible position." Miller nodded in agreement. "There's a rocky outcropping about 2 miles west. Natural fortress, with good visibility in all directions." They reached the outcropping with time to spare, positioning the wagon behind the largest rocks and preparing what weapons they had. As Deputy Miller had described, the formation provided natural protection, with clear lines of sight across the surrounding prairie. "Stay in the wagon with Hope," Garrett told Violet, handing her a loaded pistol. "Use this if you have to." She took the weapon with steady hands, her green eyes meeting his with a calmness that belied the danger of their situation. "Be careful," she said simply. The riders appeared on the horizon just as the sun began to set, silhouetted against the orange sky. Through his field glass, Deputy Miller confirmed what they had feared. "That's William Blackburn in the lead," he said grimly. "I recognize him from the wanted posters." Garrett's jaw tightened. "They must have been tracking us from Fort Boys, waiting for a moment when our guard was down." "What do we do?" Miller asked. "We're outnumbered 3-1. Garrett considered their options, none of them good. They could try to hold their position, but with only 2 rifles against 6 armed men, the outcome was all too predictable. They could attempt to negotiate, but men like the Blackburns rarely honored terms. As the riders drew closer, a third option presented itself to Garrett, one that might save Violet and Hope, even if at great cost. "I'll go out to meet them," he said quietly. "Draw them away from here." "That's suicide," Miller protested. "Not necessarily. Blackburn wants me, not my family. If I can lead them on a chase, it might give you time to get Violet and Hope to safety." Miller shook his head. "Marshal Davis ordered me to protect all of you. I can't let you sacrifice yourself." "You'll be protecting what matters most," Garrett replied, his resolve firming. "My wife and daughter." Before Miller could argue further, Garrett returned to the wagon to tell Violet his plan. Her reaction was exactly as he had expected. "No," she said firmly, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the tension surrounding them. "We stay together." "Violet, be reasonable," Garrett pleaded. "If they take me, they might leave you alone, but if we all stay here—" "We've spent too long running and hiding," she interrupted. "I won't have our daughter grow up without her father because you chose to martyr yourself." Her expression softened slightly. "There must be another way." As they debated, Deputy Miller kept watch on the approaching riders. "They've stopped," he reported, "about half a mile out. Looks like they're discussing something." Garrett joined him at the lookout position, peering through the gathering dusk. Indeed, the Blackburn party had halted, apparently assessing the defensive position the outcropping provided. "They know we've seen them," Garrett muttered. "They're deciding whether to attack now or wait until morning." As the minutes ticked by, an idea began to form in Garrett's mind, a desperate gamble, but one that might work if luck was on their side. He outlined it quickly to Miller and Violet, who listened with growing concern. "It's risky," Miller said when Garrett had finished, "but it might be our best chance." Violet was less convinced. "There are too many things that could go wrong," she argued. "There are too many things that will go wrong if we do nothing," Garrett countered gently. "Trust me, Violet, please." Looking into his eyes, Violet saw the determination that had carried him through his near death on the Kansas prairie, through their journey west, and now this latest threat. Slowly, she nodded her agreement. As darkness fell completely, they put their plan into action. Deputy Miller took one of the horses and circled wide to the south, where he would light a series of small fires to suggest a larger party was camped there, potentially the law enforcement Blackburn would want to avoid. Meanwhile, Garrett positioned himself among the rocks with both rifles, prepared to create the impression of multiple defenders if the outlaws approached. Violet, against her instincts but recognizing the necessity, took Hope and the wagon and moved carefully toward a small ravine a quarter-mile to the north, where they would be hidden from immediate sight if shooting started. The night stretched long and tense. From his position, Garrett saw Miller's fires flare to life, one after another, creating the illusion of a substantial camp. The Blackburn party noticed too. Through the field glass, Garrett could see them gesturing toward the fires, clearly concerned about what they represented. For hours, nothing happened. The outlaws maintained their position, neither advancing nor retreating. Garrett remained vigilant, aware that Violet and Hope were depending on him to keep Blackburn's attention focused away from the ravine where they had taken shelter. It was nearing dawn when movement finally occurred. 2 riders detached from the main group, heading south to investigate the fires Miller had set. The remaining 4, including Blackburn himself, began a cautious approach toward the rocky outcropping where they believed Garrett and his family were hiding. Garrett waited until they were within rifle range before firing a warning shot that kicked up dust just ahead of the lead rider. The men scattered, taking cover behind whatever the sparse landscape offered. A shouted command from Blackburn was followed by a barrage of return fire that ricocheted harmlessly off the rocks. Moving quickly between positions, Garrett fired from different locations, creating the impression of multiple defenders. It was a tactic that could only work temporarily eventually. Blackburn would realize he faced a single opponent, but it might buy the precious time they needed. The standoff continued as the sky lightened with approaching dawn. Garrett's ammunition was running low, and he had heard nothing from Miller since the deputy had departed to set the fires. He could only hope the man had been able to circle back to Violet and was now escorting her and Hope to safety. As the first direct rays of sunlight crested the horizon, a new sound reached Garrett's ears: hoofbeats, many of them, approaching rapidly from the east. For one heart-stopping moment, he feared reinforcements for Blackburn had arrived. Then he saw the riders, at least a dozen men in the distinctive attire of federal marshals, led by Marshal Davis himself. The Blackburn party, caught in the open between Garrett's position and the approaching lawmen, had nowhere to run. William Blackburn and his remaining men were arrested without further bloodshed, their brief resistance crumbling in the face of overwhelming odds. "Impeccable timing, Marshal," Garrett said as Davis approached his position among the rocks. "Deputy Miller found us on the trail," Davis explained. "Said you were in trouble." He surveyed the scene with professional assessment. "Looks like you held your own quite well. Violet and the baby?" Garrett asked anxiously. "Safe," Davis assured him. "Miller's bringing them back now." The reunion that followed was emotional, with Violet rushing into Garrett's arms while carefully cradling Hope between them. "I thought I might lose you," she whispered against his chest. "Never," he promised, holding her and their daughter close. "I made a vow, remember. Where you are is home, and I intend to keep it that way." With William Blackburn in custody, the last major threat to their safety was removed. They continued to Topeka, where Garrett provided his testimony at the trial of the Blackburn Gang. His eyewitness account, combined with evidence Marshal Davis had gathered, ensured convictions for all involved. The sentences were harsh, hanging for the ringleaders, long prison terms for the others, effectively dismantling one of the most notorious gangs in the territories. When the trial concluded in late November, Garrett and Violet faced a decision. Winter had arrived in earnest, making the journey to Oregon impossible until spring. Yet neither wanted to return to Kansas permanently, with its difficult memories and associations. "We could winter here in Topeka," Garrett suggested as they discussed their options in the small apartment they had rented during the trial. "Save our resources for a fresh start in Oregon come spring." Violet considered this as she nursed Hope, who at 3 months old was growing stronger daily. "Or we could go south," she proposed. "New Mexico Territory perhaps, or Arizona. Somewhere we could travel now and still establish ourselves before spring planting." The idea held appeal. Neither had experienced the southwestern territories, and the milder winter would be easier on both Violet and baby Hope. After consulting maps and speaking with others who had settled in the region, they decided on a small but growing community in northern Arizona Territory. They arrived in Pine Creek, Arizona Territory, just before Christmas, 1879. The settlement was nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, with a mild climate and fertile soil fed by the creek that gave the town its name. A small but diverse population of miners, ranchers, and merchants had established a community that was rapidly developing the institutions of civilization: a school, a church, and most importantly for Violet, no doctor. "They need medical skills desperately," she told Garrett after speaking with the town's unofficial mayor. "The nearest physician is in Prescott, nearly 40 miles away." With the reward money Garrett had received for his testimony against the Blackburns, they purchased a modest house on the edge of town, with enough land for a garden and small orchard. Violet quickly established a reputation as a skilled healer, her nursing experience proving invaluable in a frontier community where accidents and illness were common occurrences. Garrett, for his part, found work initially as a teamster, driving supply wagons between Pine Creek and larger settlements. His experience with horses and knowledge of frontier routes made him valuable, and within 6 months, he had saved enough to purchase his own freight wagon and team. Hope thrived in the Arizona climate, growing from a tiny, premature infant into a sturdy toddler with her mother's copper hair and her father's blue eyes. By her 2nd birthday, she was joined by a brother, Thomas Garrett Quinn, named in honor of both Violet's first husband and his father. Life in Pine Creek suited the Quinn family. The community was close-knit but welcoming to newcomers, and both Garrett and Violet found their skills respected and needed. As the years passed, they added to their holdings, eventually establishing a small ranch where Garrett raised horses, while Violet continued her medical practice from a purpose-built addition to their home. They never forgot the journey that had brought them together: a wounded man left for dead, a woman unafraid to face death and fight it back, and the love that had grown between them against all odds. The silver ring Garrett had crafted during that first winter remained on Violet's finger, joined now by a proper gold band purchased with the first profits from their ranch. On warm summer evenings, they would often sit on the porch of their Arizona home, watching Hope and Thomas play in the yard as the sun set behind the distant mountains. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Violet would think of the Kansas homestead where she had found a bleeding stranger and, in saving him, had unknowingly saved herself from a life of solitude. "Any regrets?" Garrett asked her once, noticing her thoughtful expression as she gazed toward the eastern horizon, as though looking back across the miles and years to that prairie homestead. Violet smiled, taking his hand in hers. "Not one," she replied truthfully. "Every step of the journey led us here together. How could I regret that?" As twilight deepened into night and their children were tucked into bed, Garrett and Violet Quinn stood together under the star-filled Arizona sky, their silhouettes merging into one as they embraced. From wounded stranger and fearless healer, they had become husband and wife, parents and partners in a life, neither could have imagined that day on the Kansas prairie, when death had seemed certain and second chances impossible. Yet here they stood, proof that even in the wild and often cruel frontier, love could take root and flourish, healing wounds both seen and unseen, creating from shared pain and courage a happiness that neither had dared to hope for, but both had found in each other's arms.